In the late 13th century, in a city where caravans arrived from every direction of the known world, the richest empire on earth began paying its soldiers, officials, and merchants with pieces of paper that no one actually wanted to keep. The armies were still vast. The palaces still glittered. The laws were still enforced. And yet, quietly, almost politely, the economy beneath it all was already dying. This matters because the collapse of the Mongol Yuan dynasty was not caused first by rebellion, invasion, or moral decay, but by something far more fragile and far more modern: the destruction of trust in money itself, a process that turned administrative efficiency into an invisible weapon against the state that wielded it. Picture northern China in winter. Frozen roads, smoke rising from crowded cities, warehouses stacked with grain, printing workshops humming as officials stamp seals onto freshly issued notes. Everything looks controlled, rational, managed, and that is precisely the problem. So, before we start unraveling this, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments, consider this carefully. Can an empire survive if its people obey its laws, but no longer believe its money? Now let's step into the past and see how the machinery of this world actually worked. The Mongol Empire was built on movement: horses, messengers, caravans, armies. Everything about Mongol rule favored speed, reach, and coordination across impossible distances. And when the Mongols inherited the sophisticated bureaucratic systems of China, they encountered a technology that seemed perfectly suited to their imperial instincts: paper money, light enough to travel faster than silver, easier to control than coin, and powerful enough to turn trust into a tool of governance. At first, it looked like genius. You might think paper money failed because it was primitive or poorly understood, but in reality it failed because it worked too well. Because once value could be printed rather than mined, the temptation to solve every problem with ink became irresistible. The detective moment begins not with rebellion, but with a document. Yuan banknotes, known as jiaoqiao, were printed with intimidating warnings, official seals, and promises backed not by metal, but by imperial authority itself, declaring that refusal to accept them was a crime punishable by severe penalties. Because belief was no longer voluntary, it was compulsory. This was the silent shift. Money stopped being a shared agreement. It became an order. Under Kublai Khan, paper currency was expanded dramatically, not merely as a convenience, but as a tool of central control, allowing the court to pay armies, fund construction, and manage provinces without transporting tons of silver across dangerous roads. From an administrative perspective, it was brilliant. From a human perspective, it was dangerous. For ordinary people, shopkeepers, farmers, soldiers, money is not theory. It is touch, weight, familiarity. It is something you test by handing it to someone else and seeing whether they accept it without hesitation. And at first, they did. Markets accepted the notes. Officials distributed them. Soldiers were paid with them. Because refusal was illegal, and because early on, the paper still roughly matched the value it claimed to represent. But something subtle had already changed. Trust was no longer horizontal, between people. It was vertical, between the state and the population. And vertical trust is brittle. The Mongols believed that because they ruled through overwhelming power, they could also command belief. But belief does not respond to punishment the way obedience does, because you can force someone to take paper, but you cannot force them to forget what it feels like when that paper no longer buys what it used to. The human cost began quietly. A soldier receiving paper wages could still eat, at first. A merchant accepting notes could still restock, at first. A farmer paying taxes in paper could still survive, at first. But all of this depended on one condition: that tomorrow, the paper would still mean what it meant today. The correction we must make here is important. You might think inflation starts with greed or corruption, but it often starts with success, because paper money solved real logistical problems so effectively that it encouraged the state to rely on it for everything, removing the natural brakes imposed by scarce metals and physical transport. Ink replaced restraint. The Yuan court printed to fund wars, to maintain prestige, to cover shortfalls. And each issue felt justified in isolation, because the consequences were delayed, dispersed, and initially invisible, while the benefits were immediate and spectacular. This is where the danger hides. Paper money does not fail loudly. It fails gradually, through small changes in price, subtle refusals, quiet hoarding of silver, and whispered calculations that no official ledger records. Because the first people to notice monetary decay are not ministers, but merchants and soldiers whose bodies feel the difference long before policy admits it. The irony is sharp. The Mongol Empire conquered territory faster than any power in history, yet its most dangerous vulnerability traveled even faster, moving not on horseback, but through markets, ledgers, and daily transactions where trust was being quietly recalculated with every exchange. The promise of paper money was imperial unity. Its risk was imperial dependence. And once an empire depends on belief it cannot verify daily, it begins to rule not just land and people, but expectations, which are far harder to control than borders. The Mongols believed paper money would bind the empire together. Instead, it began teaching everyone, slowly, silently, that value no longer lived in metal or goods or labor, but in the unpredictable decisions of a distant court, and that realization, once felt in the body and the market, cannot be unlearned. This is how the end begins. Not with rebellion, not with invasion, but with the moment people start asking, very quietly, whether they should accept what the state insists is valuable, or whether they should protect themselves instead. When the Mongols conquered northern China, they did not merely inherit cities, fields, and taxpayers. They inherited a monetary tradition that had evolved over centuries of trial, failure, adjustment, and cautious restraint. And this inheritance mattered because paper money was not a Mongol invention, but a Chinese one, refined through painful experience that the new rulers only partially understood. This distinction is crucial. You might assume that because paper money already existed in China, its expansion under Mongol rule was natural and safe, but in reality, earlier Chinese dynasties had learned repeatedly and painfully that paper currency only functions within strict limits because its value depends not on decree, but on confidence reinforced by scarcity redemption mechanisms and institutional credibility built slowly over time. The Mongols adopted the tool. They did not adopt the discipline. The detective moment begins in the archives. Earlier Chinese regimes had treated paper money as a supplement rather than a replacement, backing it with metal reserves, limiting issuance, and withdrawing notes aggressively when confidence wavered, because they understood something the Mongols underestimated. That money is not merely an instrument of exchange, but a social memory, recording past reliability and projecting future expectation at the same time. When that memory fractures, enforcement cannot repair it. The Yuan administration, facing the immense costs of ruling a vast, diverse empire, saw paper money as an elegant solution to logistical impossibility, because transporting silver across thousands of kilometers invited theft, delay, and loss, while paper could be printed centrally, distributed quickly, and recalled theoretically at will. Theoretically. In practice, recall required trust, and trust requires restraint. The Mongols entered this system as conquerors, not as custodians of long-standing financial norms, and conquest encourages a particular kind of confidence. The belief that authority once established militarily can substitute for consensus indefinitely, because armies can compel behavior when belief weakens. This belief was only partially true. Yes, the state could force acceptance of paper notes. It could punish refusal. It could threaten merchants and officials. But it could not force valuation, because valuation happens privately, in the mind, at the moment of exchange, when someone decides whether a piece of paper is worth a sack of grain, a month of labor, or a soldier's life. That decision cannot be audited. The human cost of this misunderstanding surfaced early among those who lived closest to markets. Merchants began to price cautiously, adding margins to compensate for uncertainty. Farmers preferred barter or metal when possible, hiding silver when they could. Soldiers accepted paper wages, but spent them quickly, knowing instinctively that holding them carried risk, and rapid spending is one of the earliest symptoms of declining confidence, because money that cannot be trusted tomorrow must be used today. The correction to make here is subtle but essential. You might think the Mongols ruined paper money through ignorance, but in fact they understood its power perfectly. What they underestimated was its fragility, because power that depends on belief erodes faster than power that depends on force, and once belief starts to erode, acceleration becomes the state's instinctive response. Print more. Pay more. Stabilize now. Fix later. Each step feels rational. Each step deepens the problem. Earlier Chinese administrations had treated inflation as a warning sign, a signal to pull back, tighten issuance, and restore confidence through sacrifice and reform, but the Mongols faced a different psychological pressure because their legitimacy did not rest on tradition or shared cultural memory, but on performance, military success, order, and visible prosperity. And paper money allowed them to maintain the appearance of prosperity long after underlying value began to slip. Appearance became policy. This is where borrowed genius turns dangerous. A system designed to function within cultural expectations of restraint, continuity, and reciprocity was now operating under a regime that prized speed, scale, and immediate results, and paper money, when removed from its original context, became not a stabilizer, but an amplifier, magnifying every fiscal mistake rather than cushioning it. The human mind adapts quickly to signals of unreliability. People may obey laws reluctantly. They do not hold unreliable money willingly. And so markets began to develop two realities at once. The official one, where prices were quoted in paper and transactions complied with law, and the private one, where real value was calculated in silver, grain, or goods, hidden from records and invisible to officials who still believed the system functioned because markets remained open and taxes were still collected. This duality is lethal. Once a society runs two price systems, one public, one real, the state loses the ability to measure its own economy accurately because reports lie not out of malice, but out of survival, and policy built on false signals inevitably worsens the underlying condition. There is an irony that borders on tragedy. The Mongols adopted paper money to simplify rule across diversity, yet by misunderstanding the cultural and institutional scaffolding that made it viable. They created a currency that worked best for the center and worst for the periphery, accelerating inequality, resentment, and quiet withdrawal from official economic life. The empire still functioned. Taxes were still collected. Armies were still paid. But beneath this apparent order, trust was thinning, not disappearing suddenly. Thinning. And thinning trust does not provoke revolt immediately. It provokes adaptation, as people learn to comply outwardly while protecting themselves inwardly, creating a society that appears obedient but is internally disengaged from the state's economic logic. This disengagement matters. An empire can survive dissent. It cannot survive indifference to its money. The Mongols believed they had inherited a financial technology that would make empire effortless. What they inherited instead was a delicate system that required humility, patience, and restraint, qualities difficult to sustain when ruling through conquest and constant expansion. Paper money did not doom the Yuan dynasty by itself. What doomed it was the assumption that trust could be commanded rather than cultivated, that belief could be legislated rather than earned, and that tools developed in one cultural and institutional environment would function unchanged in another. By the time this realization began to dawn on administrators, it was already too late to reverse course easily, because restoring confidence requires contraction, sacrifice, and admission of error, and empires, like individuals, rarely choose those willingly when expansion still seems possible. This is how the borrowed genius of Chinese monetary innovation became, under Mongol rule, a slow-burning fuse. Not because paper money was flawed, but because trust, once borrowed, cannot be printed back into existence. At a certain point, the Yuan court stopped treating paper money as an experiment and began treating it as a test of obedience, because once doubts surfaced about value, officials faced a choice they did not fully acknowledge. Either restore trust through restraint and contraction, or enforce belief through law, and enforcement, in the short term, always feels faster, cleaner, and more decisive. They chose enforcement. This choice marks a quiet but decisive turning point, because money ceases to function as money the moment acceptance is no longer voluntary. Even if transactions continue outwardly as before, and the Mongol administration crossed that line when it declared paper notes compulsory legal tender for all payments, private and public, attaching harsh penalties to refusal. You might think this would solve the problem. After all, if everyone must accept paper, then paper remains valuable, at least in practice. But this misunderstands how value operates. Value does not live in law. It lives in expectation. And expectation, once shaken, does not respond to threats the way behavior does. The detective moment here is not a dramatic rebellion, but a clause in an imperial decree, the kind written in formal language, stamped with seals, and distributed through provincial offices, stating that refusal to accept official notes was a punishable offense, equating economic skepticism with political disloyalty. This was the moment belief was criminalized. From the perspective of the court, the logic was sound. If paper money represented imperial authority, then rejecting it was rejecting the state, and a state built by conquest does not tolerate symbolic defiance lightly, especially when that defiance threatens its fiscal foundations. From the perspective of ordinary people, however, something fundamental shifted. Money became dangerous to hold. A farmer who accepted paper for grain now carried not just value, but risk, because the note's purchasing power was no longer determined by market exchange alone, but by unpredictable policy decisions issued from a distant capital. And uncertainty of this kind is felt immediately in the body, as anxiety, hesitation, and a constant calculation of how quickly value might evaporate. The human cost of compulsory belief surfaced in small, telling behaviors. Merchants raised prices quietly, not to cheat, but to protect themselves against future devaluation. Workers demanded payment more frequently, preferring immediate exchange to delayed compensation. Soldiers spent wages as soon as they received them, because saving paper felt irrational when tomorrow's decree might change its worth. This behavior was not rebellion. It was self-preservation. Here we must correct a common misunderstanding. You might assume that inflation worsens because people lose discipline or become greedy, but in reality inflation worsens because rational actors adapt to uncertainty by accelerating exchange. An accelerated exchange increases velocity, which magnifies price instability, creating a feedback loop that no decree can halt. The Mongol administration responded predictably. As prices rose, it blamed merchants. As confidence fell, it blamed hoarders. As shortages appeared, it blamed speculation. Each accusation felt plausible. Each missed the point. The problem was not behavior. It was credibility. By forcing acceptance, the state revealed that acceptance no longer came naturally. And once that revelation occurs, belief collapses faster, not slower, because compulsion signals weakness even as it asserts authority. There is a deep irony here. The Mongols had conquered vast territories through overwhelming force, yet in monetary matters force produced diminishing returns because every new threat confirmed what people already suspected, that the paper in their hands was valuable only as long as the state insisted it was. And insistence is not confidence. Confidence does not need to shout. Another layer emerges when we consider administration. Provincial officials were tasked with enforcing acceptance, collecting taxes and paper, and reporting stability to the capital, but these officials lived among the people affected by policy, and many quietly understood the problem, yet telling the truth upward was dangerous, because admitting declining confidence could be interpreted as administrative failure or political disloyalty. So reports became optimistic. Figures became massaged. Warnings softened. This informational distortion is fatal. A state that relies on paper money relies on accurate signals, because monetary stability requires timely correction, and when information is filtered to protect careers rather than truth, inflation accelerates unnoticed until reversal becomes politically and economically unbearable. The human mind adapts again. Once people sense that officials themselves no longer fully believe the currency they enforce, respect erodes further, because authority that enforces without conviction invites quiet contempt, and contempt is the seabed of noncompliance. Markets did not shut down. They adapted sideways. Barter increased in private. Silver disappeared from circulation. Foreign merchants demanded metal or raised prices dramatically to compensate for risk. The official economy continued on paper. The real economy began slipping away. This dual economy is the empire's invisible fracture. To the court, order persisted. Taxes arrived. Accounts balanced. Armies marched. To the population, value felt unstable, arbitrary, and politicized. And once money feels political rather than practical, people disengage emotionally, treating compliance as a temporary necessity rather than a shared system worth sustaining. Compulsory belief achieved short-term stability at the cost of long-term legitimacy. And legitimacy is the only thing paper money ultimately rests on. The Mongol rulers believed they were asserting sovereignty. In reality, they were exposing dependence. An empire that must force belief in its currency announces that belief has already begun to fail, and once that signal spreads through markets, villages, and camps, it cannot be recalled with the same ease as printed notes. This is how monetary systems die, not through sudden collapse, but through a steady retreat of trust from public space into private calculation until money continues to circulate in appearance only, while value migrates elsewhere, leaving the state administering a hollow shell. By the time the Yuan court recognized that compulsion had not restored confidence, but had accelerated its erosion, the tools available to reverse course had narrowed dangerously, because restoring trust requires restraint, contraction, and visible sacrifice, and each of these undermines the appearance of imperial strength that conquest-based regimes depend on. The decree that forced belief did not stabilize the empire. It locked it into a path where every future crisis would be answered with more printing, more enforcement, and more denial, deepening the gap between official value and lived reality. Once belief is forced, it is no longer belief. And money without belief is just paper moving from hand to hand, obeyed by law, but rejected by instinct. This was the moment the Yuan economy stopped being resilient. It became fragile, and fragility, once institutionalized, spreads silently, long before collapse announces itself to the world. Once paper money had been declared compulsory, the Yuan state discovered something both intoxicating and dangerous. It could finance power without immediately confronting its limits, because ink could be produced faster than silver, could be mined, transported, or taxed, and this discovery quietly altered how the empire understood cost, sacrifice, and consequence. This is where success becomes lethal. You might think the greatest danger to an empire is scarcity, the moment when resources run out and choices become painful. But in reality, abundance without constraint is far more corrosive, because it delays reckoning while amplifying dependence, and paper money offered exactly that illusion, an endless reservoir of purchasing power that appeared to remove the need for difficult trade-offs. Wars could be funded without raising taxes. Projects could be launched without waiting for revenue. Officials could be paid without securing metal. Everything felt possible. And when everything feels possible, restraint feels unnecessary. The detective moment here is not a battlefield or a riot, but a budget, because under the Yuan, military campaigns, court expenditure, and monumental construction increasingly relied on freshly issued notes rather than accumulated reserves, shifting the empire from a system that measured capacity in physical assets to one that measured it in confidence, a far more volatile and less visible metric. At first, the results were impressive. Armies moved quickly, logistics appeared smooth, supplies arrived on time. From the center, the system looked efficient, even elegant, reinforcing the belief that paper money was not merely a convenience, but a strategic advantage, allowing the Mongol state to project power without the friction that had constrained earlier empires. But power funded by printing carries a hidden cost. When victory no longer requires sacrifice, decision-making changes, because leaders are no longer forced to weigh the immediate pain of taxation or requisition against the benefits of action, and without that friction, expansion accelerates beyond sustainable limits. Ink removed feedback. This corrects a critical misconception. You might assume that inflation arises because rulers are careless or corrupt, but often it arises because systems become too good at solving short-term problems, allowing those problems to multiply unnoticed until they overwhelm the structure that supports them. Paper money allowed the Yuan court to postpone difficult conversations about limits. And postponed limits grow. The human cost of this monetary power was not immediate hunger or revolt, but exhaustion. Soldiers found that while they were paid regularly, their wages bought less each season, forcing them to supplement income through requisition or side trade, straining relations with local populations. Officials received salaries on time, but discovered that maintaining their households required constant adjustment, borrowing, or favor-seeking, entangling administration in informal networks that blurred duty and survival. Merchants accepted payment eagerly when it arrived, but spent it defensively, converting paper into goods or metal as quickly as possible, increasing velocity and price pressure without ever announcing dissent. Everyone adapted, and adaptation hides crisis. There is a deep irony here. The Mongols had built their empire on clear, brutal feedback, victory or defeat, obedience, or resistance. Yet paper money replaced that clarity with abstraction, turning costs into delayed consequences and decisions into future problems, weakening the empire's instinct for correction. Because nothing seemed broken, markets still functioned, armies still marched, officials still reported stability. Yet beneath this surface, a quiet shift was underway. The empire began living off tomorrow, using future trust to pay present obligations. And once that habit forms, reversing it requires contraction so painful that leaders rarely choose it voluntarily. Printing power also reshaped internal politics. Officials who controlled issuance gained influence disproportionate to their formal rank, because access to new notes meant access to favors, salaries, and survival, creating incentives to underreport inflation, delay warnings, and frame continued printing as temporary necessity rather than systemic risk. This informational distortion matters enormously. A paper-based system relies on honest signals. When signals are filtered, correction comes too late. The Mongol state still believed it ruled through command. In reality, it was beginning to rule through credibility, and credibility erodes silently, long before obedience fails. There is another layer. Foreign merchants who were less subject to enforcement and less emotionally invested in imperial legitimacy began demanding higher prices or refusing paper altogether, preferring silver or goods, and their behavior sent an unspoken message through markets that those with options were opting out. This is always a warning sign. When the most mobile actors begin to disengage, trust is already leaking. The state responded by printing more, hoping to meet rising prices with increased supply, misunderstanding that prices were rising not because money was scarce, but because confidence was thinning, and more paper could not thicken confidence. The feedback loop tightened. Printing solved immediate shortages. Printing worsened long-term trust. Worsened trust required more printing. At each step, administrators could plausibly argue that stopping would be worse, because stopping meant admitting failure, risking panic, and exposing the fragility of the system, and so continuation felt safer than reform, even as it deepened dependence. The human body senses this before theory does. People felt it in longer market negotiations, in the instinct to convert paper quickly, in the subtle tension of accepting wages that no longer guaranteed stability. And these sensations accumulate psychologically, producing anxiety rather than anger, caution rather than revolt. Empires fall not only when people rebel, but when they stop believing that official systems will protect them tomorrow. Paper money funded victories. It built cities. It paid armies. And in doing so, it trained the empire to rely on a resource that could not be replenished by force or decree once confidence weakened. This is the central paradox. The Mongol Empire conquered more land than any power before it, yet its most important resource was not land or soldiers, but belief, and belief, unlike territory, cannot be seized once lost. By the time the Yuan court recognized that printing power had replaced fiscal discipline rather than supported it, the empire was already trapped in a system where survival required continued issuance, because withdrawal would reveal how much of the state's apparent strength rested on paper rather than substance. Victory no longer required silver, but survival still required trust. And trust, once spent too freely, does not regenerate at the speed of ink. This was the moment when paper money stopped being a tool of empire and became its quiet dependency, binding the state to a cycle where every attempt to preserve power through printing made the foundations of that power thinner. The empire still looked strong, but its strength had become conditional. And conditional strength, like conditional belief, collapses not with a crash, but with a slow, spreading refusal to fully commit to the system that demands it. This is how monetary convenience turns into strategic vulnerability, not by failing loudly, but by succeeding just long enough to make retreat impossible. Inflation under the Yuan did not arrive as a catastrophe. It arrived as a drift. This is why it was so dangerous. You might imagine inflation as a sudden spike in prices, a clear signal that something has gone wrong. But in the Mongol Empire, it unfolded far more quietly, as a series of small, almost reasonable adjustments that made perfect sense in isolation and revealed their destructive power only when viewed over time. At first, prices rose slightly, not enough to provoke anger, not enough to trigger revolt, just enough to be explained away. Officials blamed transport costs. Merchants blamed instability. Consumers blamed bad harvests. Everyone found a cause that avoided the larger conclusion, because the larger conclusion, that the money itself was changing, was psychologically difficult to accept in a system where questioning currency had become politically dangerous. The detective moment lies in market behavior rather than policy. Records from the period show prices creeping upward unevenly, with essentials like grain, cloth, and fuel rising faster than luxury goods, because inflation always strikes the body before it strikes status, forcing ordinary people to adjust diets, clothing, and routines long before elites feel pressure. This is the first human signal. A household that once bought grain monthly now bought weekly. A worker paid in paper now spent wages immediately. A merchant recalculated prices constantly, not to profit, but to survive. None of this looked like rebellion. It looked like adaptation. And adaptation masks decay. The Mongol administration interpreted this adaptation incorrectly. Because markets still functioned and goods still moved, officials concluded that the system was stable, failing to see that stability had shifted from confidence to momentum, and momentum can continue long after confidence has begun to leak away. This is the critical correction. You might think inflation becomes obvious as soon as it starts, but in reality early inflation is invisible precisely because people compensate, tightening habits, changing behavior, and absorbing losses silently rather than protesting openly. The pain is dispersed. The silence is misleading. The human cost accumulated slowly in bodies and minds. People worked longer hours for the same outcome. Families reduced consumption without complaint. Soldiers found that pay no longer matched effort. Fatigue replaced outrage. And fatigue does not challenge power. It endures it. There is a deep irony here. The Mongols believed that order meant obedience, and because obedience continued, they assumed legitimacy remained intact. Yet legitimacy in a monetary system depends not on obedience, but on expectation, and expectation was being revised downward quietly, day by day, transaction by transaction. Once expectation shifts, policy loses traction. The Yuan court responded to rising prices with familiar tools. More printing to ease shortages. Price controls to protect the people. Punishments for speculators. Each measure addressed symptoms rather than cause. More money increased velocity. Controls reduced supply. Punishments drove trade underground. The system became less visible, not more stable. Inflation thrives in darkness. The human response grew more sophisticated. People learned to hold value in forms the state could not print. Silver hidden away, grain stored privately, relationships leveraged for access. And these strategies fractured the economy into parallel layers, one official, one real, making accurate measurement impossible. Once the state cannot measure reality, it cannot govern it. This is the turning point. Not collapse. Blindness. Officials still received reports. Ledgers still balanced. Taxes still arrived. But the meaning of those numbers had changed because they were denominated in a currency that no longer reflected lived value. And policy built on distorted measurement accelerates failure even when intentions are sincere. The empire began making decisions based on shadows. There is another human layer. As inflation normalized, people stopped discussing it openly because naming the problem felt risky and silence became a survival skill. Producing a society that complied publicly while recalculating privately. And this split corrodes collective response, because when everyone feels pressure but no one speaks, coordination becomes impossible. Empires do not fall when people complain. They fall when people stop believing complaint will matter. By the time inflation became undeniable at the center, the periphery had already adapted beyond recovery, with trust withdrawn so deeply that even reforms would have been greeted with skepticism rather than relief. This is why inflation is lethal to empires. Not because it impoverishes instantly, but because it teaches people to live around the state rather than through it. The Mongol rulers had built an empire on mobility and control. Inflation immobilized trust. Once trust stopped moving freely through the economy, the empire's reach shortened invisibly, not at the borders, but in markets, villages, and camps where paper still circulated, but belief no longer did. The inflation nobody could see was already rewriting behavior. And behavior, once changed, does not reverse simply because policy does. By the time prices finally surged dramatically enough to alarm the court, the most important damage had already occurred. People no longer planned their futures in terms of the state's money, and a state whose currency no longer structures the future has already lost its most subtle form of power. Inflation did not announce the end of the Mongol Empire. It prepared it, quietly, patiently, transaction by transaction. The moment an economy begins to fracture is rarely marked by riots, proclamations, or open defiance, but by something far quieter and far more decisive. Merchants stop believing what the state says is real, because merchants live at the intersection of trust and survival, and when official value diverges from lived experience, they adjust first, not out of ideology, but out of necessity. This is where the Yuan economy crossed a line it could not easily return from. You might assume that merchants, dependent on state permission and vulnerable to punishment, would be the last group to challenge official currency, but in fact they are always the first to reinterpret it, because their bodies feel monetary distortion immediately, in margins that shrink, inventories that misalign, and transactions that no longer add up even when everyone follows the rules. At first, refusal did not look like refusal. It looked like caution. Prices were quoted higher to account for uncertainty. Large transactions quietly demanded silver for stability. Paper was accepted, but only reluctantly, and never held longer than necessary. This was not rebellion. It was recalibration. The detective moment lies in market patterns rather than documents. When paper money still circulated widely, but was immediately converted into goods, metal, or foreign exchange whenever possible, it signaled that money had stopped being a store of value and had become merely a temporary token, something to pass along before it decayed further. This behavior accelerates collapse. Money that cannot rest cannot stabilize. The Mongol administration interpreted merchant behavior as greed. This was a fatal misreading. Merchants were not extracting value from the system. They were fleeing uncertainty, because no rational actor holds an asset whose future worth is controlled by unpredictable decree, especially when past decrees have already altered that worth repeatedly. The human cost of this shift was immediate and uneven. Urban consumers found prices rising faster than wages. Rural producers found payment less reliable than before. Soldiers paid in paper discovered that market prices no longer respected official rates. Trust broke asymmetrically, striking those closest to daily exchange first. There is an important correction here. You might think merchants destabilize economies through selfishness, but in reality they reveal instability long before states admit it. Because markets do not lie out of malice. They lie only when policy makes truth dangerous. Once merchants realized that honesty about value carried risk, silence and distortion became survival strategies, and an economy built on distorted signals cannot correct itself, because feedback no longer reaches decision-makers in time. Foreign merchants amplified the problem. They had options. They could leave. They could demand silver. They could price risk openly. And their behavior sent a powerful signal through local markets. If those least bound to the state refuse paper, then paper is already compromised. Confidence is contagious. So is doubt. The Yuan state responded predictably. Edicts tightened. Inspections increased. Penalties multiplied. But enforcement cannot create belief. It can only suppress expression. And suppressed doubt does not disappear. It migrates into private calculation, hidden trade, and parallel systems that erode state visibility. The economy split. Official prices existed on paper. Real prices existed in practice. This duality is lethal. Once an empire runs two economies simultaneously, it loses the ability to plan, because policy is aimed at the official economy while the real one evolves beyond reach. The human mind adapts again. People stopped planning long-term in paper terms. Savings disappeared. Contracts shortened. Wages demanded immediacy. The future collapsed inward. And when people stopped trusting money to carry value forward in time, they stopped trusting the state that issues it to protect tomorrow. There is a cruel irony here. The Mongol Empire had conquered vast territories through decisive force, yet in its economic heart, it faced a challenge that force could not solve, because merchants were not defying authority. They were withdrawing belief, and belief, once withdrawn, cannot be coerced back without destroying the system that depends on it. Officials continued to report compliance. Markets continued to function. But function without faith is hollow. Merchants did not overthrow the yuan. They simply stopped carrying its monetary logic forward, transaction by transaction, until the state's currency circulated in form but not in spirit, obeyed by law but rejected by instinct. This is how empires lose their grip. Not when people shout, but when they stop listening. And once merchants begin to refuse reality, quietly, rationally, defensively, the state is already negotiating with a world it no longer fully understands. When an empire's money begins to fail, the first group to feel the consequences is not the court, not the ministers, and not even the merchants, but the soldiers, because soldiers live at the point where value meets survival, and when pay loses meaning, loyalty does not disappear immediately. It mutates. At first, nothing looked wrong. The Yuan armies were still paid on time. The notes still bore imperial seals. The rolls were still called. On paper, discipline held. But on the ground, something vital had shifted. You might think soldiers rebel the moment their wages lose value, but in reality, the process is far slower and far more dangerous. Because soldiers adapt before they revolt, and adaptation inside an army changes its moral structure long before it changes its behavior. A soldier paid in paper that buys less each season does not immediately mutiny. He adjusts. He takes more from the countryside. He delays payment to locals. He accepts informal compensation. These acts are not framed as theft. They are framed as survival. The detective moment appears in complaints rather than battles. Provincial records begin to mention friction between garrisons and civilians, reports of requisition without compensation, of forced purchases at official prices that no longer reflect reality, and of resentment spreading quietly through villages that now associate imperial authority not with order, but with economic pressure. This is the first fracture between army and population. The Mongol state had built its legitimacy on military protection. Now the military itself became a source of instability, not because soldiers were disloyal, but because the currency meant to sustain them no longer functioned as promised. The human cost here is visceral. A soldier who cannot feed his family on his wages experiences shame before anger, anxiety before rebellion, and prolonged anxiety erodes discipline more reliably than hunger, because it teaches soldiers to prioritize immediate gain over abstract loyalty. Loyalty does not vanish. It is repriced. You might assume the solution would be to raise pay. The state tried. But raising pay in paper only deepened the problem, because it confirmed what soldiers already sensed, that the state could not stabilize value, only issue more claims on it. Each raise felt hollow. Each promise shorter-lived. This corrects a common misconception. You might think armies collapse when they are unpaid, but far more often they collapse when they are paid in something unreliable. Because unreliable pay forces soldiers to seek certainty elsewhere, and certainty is found in commanders' local power brokers or personal networks, not in distant administrations. This is how loyalty shifts from institution to individual. Officers, sensing the danger, began tolerating behavior that would once have been punished, because enforcing discipline without economic stability risks mutiny, and so standards loosened quietly, not by decree, but by necessity. Discipline became negotiable. Negotiable discipline dissolves hierarchy. The Mongol military had once thrived on clarity. Orders were clear. Rewards were tangible. Punishments were certain. Paper money blurred all three. When rewards lose meaning, punishment loses legitimacy, because punishment presumes a shared understanding of obligation, and obligation weakens when the state fails to uphold its side of the exchange. Soldiers still fought, but they fought differently. More for immediate survival than long-term order. More for commanders than for abstract empire. More for loot than for salary. This shift does not announce itself. It spreads. And once spread, it cannot be reversed quickly. The state responded with stricter enforcement. Harsh penalties. Public discipline. Legal reminders of duty. But duty enforced without credible compensation feels like exploitation, and exploitation breeds quiet resentment rather than renewed loyalty. Here lies the deepest irony. The Mongol Empire had been forged through military cohesion stronger than any state before it, yet that cohesion depended on clear material exchange, service for security, obedience for reward, and paper money dissolved that clarity by inserting uncertainty at the core of the bargain. By the time unrest appeared openly, the psychological contract had already collapsed. The soldiers no longer trusted the future the state promised. They trusted only what they could take, secure, or convert immediately. and an army that thinks only in the present cannot defend an empire built for the future. This is how monetary failure becomes military weakness, not by empty treasuries, but by hollowed loyalty. When soldiers are paid in paper but must spend blood to make it meaningful, the empire has already crossed a line it cannot easily uncross. Because restoring loyalty requires restoring trust, and trust cannot be marched back into existence by decree. The Yuan armies would continue to exist. They would continue to fight, but they would no longer anchor the empire. They would drain it. And once an army drains the society it is meant to protect, collapse is no longer a question of if, but of how quietly it will spread. When paper money began to fail in practice, the most dangerous reaction inside the Yuan state was not denial at the top, but distortion in the middle, because empires do not collapse when leaders make bad decisions alone. They collapse when information stops moving upward honestly, leaving decision-makers blind while insisting they can still see. This is where panic turns systemic. You might imagine provincial officials rushing to warn the capital, sounding alarms about inflation, unrest, and declining confidence. But the reality was far more human and far more destructive, because telling the truth in an empire built on performance carried risk, and risk encourages silence long before it encourages rebellion. Officials understood the problem. They saw prices rising. They saw merchants withdrawing. They saw soldiers straining local economies. But they also understood something else. Bad news traveled upward as blame, not as data. So reports softened. Inflation became temporary fluctuation. Shortages became local irregularities. Unrest became isolated disorder. No one lied outright. They simply edited reality. The detective moment appears in the paperwork. Tax receipts arrived on time, but in devalued paper. Production targets were met, but only nominally. Supply chains appeared intact until they weren't. On paper, the empire functioned. In villages and markets, it did not. This informational gap is lethal in a paper money system because paper currency depends entirely on early correction, on small adjustments made before confidence collapses fully, and those adjustments require honest signals, not optimistic narratives crafted to protect careers. The human cost of administrative distortion was immediate at the local level. Provincial governors delayed intervention because intervention required admitting failure. Local officials extracted more from communities to meet quotas, worsening resentment. Magistrates enforced currency laws more harshly, mistaking fear for control. Each action intensified panic. Panic does not always look like flight. Often it looks like overcompliance, as people rush to convert paper into goods, into favors, into safety, creating shortages that appear sudden but are actually the product of accumulated distrust. Grain disappeared into private storage. Silver vanished from circulation. Barter reemerged quietly. The state saw scarcity. The people felt threat. The correction here is essential. You might think empires fail because leaders are cruel or incompetent, but far more often they fail because systems punish truth, training officials to present stability rather than diagnose fragility, until fragility hardens into reality. The Yuan court still believed it governed through information. In truth, it governed through echoes. And echoes cannot warn. Provincial panic fed back into monetary policy in a destructive loop. As reports minimized inflation, the center printed more to meet obligations it believed were manageable. More printing worsened local confidence. Worsened confidence increased concealment. Increased concealment made reports less accurate. The loop tightened. This is how monetary collapse accelerates without appearing dramatic. No single decree causes it. No single riot announces it. It spreads through fear of responsibility. The human mind adapts again. Officials began acting defensively rather than strategically, prioritizing short-term compliance over long-term stability, because survival within bureaucracy depends on appearing effective, not on being correct. People stopped expecting solutions from above. They began solving problems locally. Local solutions weaken empires, because empires depend on coordination. Once coordination dissolves into improvisation, authority fragments. The Yuan state responded as it knew how. More inspections, more audits, more punishment for corruption. But punishment aimed at symptoms cannot cure systemic blindness, and punishment, when applied broadly, teaches officials to hide problems better, not to solve them. There is a dark irony here. The Mongols had conquered China through rapid intelligence mobility and honest battlefield reporting, yet their empire began to fail because its civilian administration learned to lie politely, efficiently and convincingly, turning information into a performance rather than a warning system. By the time panic reached the capital, unmistakably, it was no longer localized. It was embedded. Markets had adapted beyond control. Soldiers had adjusted loyalty. Merchants had recalibrated reality. At that stage, reform required contraction so severe that it threatened the legitimacy of the regime itself, because contraction meant admitting that years of policy had been wrong, that obedience had been demanded in service of a fiction, and that trust had been spent without consent. Empires rarely survive that admission, so they delay. Delay feels safer. Delay feels orderly. But delay in a paper-based system is fatal, because confidence decays continuously, not in steps. And once decay passes a certain threshold, no decree, no reform, no promise can restore it quickly enough to prevent collapse. Administrative lies did not cause panic. They trapped it. They ensured that by the time leaders understood the scale of the problem no longer had a solution proportional to the tools available. This is the quiet death of empire. Not through conquest, not through rebellion, but through a state that continues to speak confidently while reality has already stopped listening. By the time the Yuan administration fully understood that paper money was no longer trusted, it faced a problem far more serious than inflation itself. It could no longer accurately measure reality, because an empire that cannot tax truth cannot govern effectively, no matter how powerful its armies or how severe its laws. This is where collapse becomes inevitable. You might think an empire fails when it runs out of money, but far more often it fails when it runs out of reliable information, because taxation is not merely extraction, it is diagnosis, a way for the state to read the health of its economy through what people can and cannot pay. And once currency stops reflecting real value, every report becomes a distortion. On paper, revenue continued to arrive. Taxes were paid in official notes. Accounts balanced neatly. Ledgers showed compliance. But those numbers had lost contact with lived reality. The detective moment lies in administrative correspondence. Provincial officials began reporting stability while privately hoarding silver because admitting declining value risked punishment. And punishment in a system built on forced belief does not correct error. It suppresses honesty, pushing bad news downward until it disappears entirely from official awareness. This informational blindness is fatal. When officials fear truth more than failure, the state begins governing a fiction. The human cost of this blindness was immediate. Local administrators, unable to collect real value through official channels, resorted to informal levies, temporary requisitions, and negotiated compliance, extracting resources outside formal taxation, which blurred the boundary between governance and exploitation and taught populations that survival depended not on law, but on negotiation, concealment, and favor. Taxation lost legitimacy. Once taxation loses legitimacy, resistance becomes passive rather than violent. People comply outwardly. They hide inwardly. And hidden economies grow faster than states realize. This corrects a crucial misconception. You might think corruption destroys empires, but in reality corruption often replaces governance when governance loses accuracy. Because informal systems arise to compensate for official blindness, keeping society functioning while hollowing out the state's authority. The Yuan court still believed it ruled through command. In practice, it now ruled through approximation. Tax assessments no longer reflected productivity. Military budgets no longer reflected real cost. Administrative planning relied on numbers that looked precise but meant nothing. Policy became guesswork, and guesswork compounds error. There is a deep irony here. Paper money had been adopted to improve administrative efficiency, yet it ultimately destroyed the state's ability to see its own economy clearly. Because once value becomes unstable, every statistic becomes suspect, and once statistics are suspect, planning becomes ritual rather than strategy. The empire still issued edicts, still held court, still punished offenders, but it was now reacting to symptoms it could not interpret correctly, mistaking inflation for shortage, hoarding for rebellion, and adaptation for defiance, applying force where reform was needed and printing where restraint was essential. Each mistake deepened mistrust. The human response was quiet disengagement. People stopped expecting the state to understand their situation. They stopped appealing to officials. They stopped planning within official frameworks. And a state that people stop appealing to has already lost its moral center. Foreign pressures intensified the problem. Tribute demands, military logistics, and border defense all relied on accurate fiscal assessment. Yet with distorted taxation, the empire found itself perpetually short of real resources despite full coffers on paper, forcing it to extract more aggressively, which accelerated withdrawal from the official economy. This is the collapse loop. Distorted money, distorted data, bad policy, deeper distortion. Once entered, this loop is almost impossible to exit without radical contraction, because admitting the scale of error requires political humility that conquest-based regimes rarely display voluntarily. The Yuan dynasty reached this point quietly. No dramatic decree announced it. No rebellion caused it. It simply became clear, too late, that the empire could no longer tell the difference between obedience and survival behavior, between loyalty and compliance, between value and symbol. And without that distinction, taxation ceased to be governance and became mere pressure. This is the final stage before visible collapse. Not bankruptcy, not rebellion, but blindness. An empire that cannot tax truth cannot correct itself, cannot plan honestly, and cannot regain trust, because trust requires acknowledgement of reality, and reality had already slipped beyond the reach of ink, seals, and law. The Mongol rulers still commanded territory. They still commanded armies. But they no longer commanded belief in the numbers that sustained their rule. And once belief in numbers is gone, every future decision is built on sand. By the time the Yuan dynasty finally began to lose territorial control, the real collapse had already occurred, far from battlefields, rebellions, or palace coups, because the Mongol state did not first lose cities or armies. It lost credibility, and credibility, once damaged, does not announce its death with noise or spectacle, but withdraws quietly from every system that depends on it. This is the final mechanism. You might expect the end of an empire to be visible: invasions, revolts, burning capitals, dramatic moments that feel decisive. Yet in the case of Yuan China, the most important collapse happened in accounting rooms, marketplaces, and pay lines, where people continued to obey orders while silently disengaging from the meaning behind them. The state still issued commands. People still complied, but belief had already moved elsewhere. The detective moment here is absence rather than presence. There is no single document announcing the failure of paper money. No decree admitting collapse. No official confession. Instead, there is a gradual disappearance of honest participation. As taxes are paid reluctantly, trade becomes defensive, soldiers comply without conviction, and administrators report stability while privately preparing for uncertainty. This is how systems die without realizing it. The Yuan court continued to print, regulate, punish, and adjust, convinced that more administration could repair what was fundamentally a crisis of trust, not capacity. Yet trust does not respond to administrative effort once it has been politicized, because politicized trust is no longer mutual. It is hierarchical, and hierarchy cannot sustain belief indefinitely. The human cost of this realization was psychological. People stopped planning in years. They planned in weeks, sometimes in days. When money ceases to represent the future reliably, society contracts inward, abandoning long-term coordination in favor of immediate security. And long-term coordination is precisely what large empires require in order to function. Infrastructure decays quietly. Tax bases hollow out unevenly. Military logistics become brittle. None of these failures look catastrophic at first. They look manageable, until suddenly they are not. There is a critical misconception to correct here. You might think paper money killed the Mongol Empire because it caused inflation, but inflation alone does not destroy states. Many survive it. What destroyed the yuan was something deeper: the loss of informational integrity, because once money stops communicating real value, the state stops seeing reality clearly, and policy becomes reactive rather than corrective. The empire began governing a shadow economy of its own creation. Reports looked stable, numbers balanced, targets were met. But those numbers no longer described lived conditions, because people had adapted behaviorally rather than confrontationally, complying outwardly while withdrawing trust inwardly, and no empire can survive when its population obeys without believing. This is the final irony. The Mongols conquered through overwhelming force, speed, and coordination, Yet their downfall came from a system that required the opposite: patience, restraint, and humility, because paper money only works when those who issue it accept limits, and empires built on conquest struggle to accept limits psychologically. Ink outlasted steel. The notes continued to circulate. The seals remained intact. The bureaucracy functioned. But trust did not. And trust is the invisible infrastructure of all large systems. Once trust erodes, every policy costs more to enforce. Every transaction carries friction. Every promise requires threat. And threat cannot replace belief forever, because threat exhausts both ruler and ruled. The Mongol Empire did not fall because it adopted paper money. It fell because it treated paper money as authority itself, rather than as a fragile agreement that required constant credibility, transparency, and contraction when necessary. In the end, paper did what armies could not. It revealed the limits of command. You can force acceptance. You can punish refusal. You can print endlessly. But you cannot command confidence. And without confidence, even the largest empire becomes administratively blind, economically brittle, and socially disengaged long before enemies arrive to finish the job. This is why the Yuan collapse feels modern. Because it is. It is a story not of invasion, but of mismanaged abstraction, not of rebellion, but of disengagement, not of sudden failure, but of quiet withdrawal from belief, transaction by transaction, until the state is left governing forms without substance. Steel conquers land. Ink governs systems. But only trust keeps them alive. When trust dies, empires continue moving for a while, out of habit, momentum, and fear, but they are already ghosts, enforcing rules that no longer structure the future. That was the fate of the Mongol Yuan dynasty, not defeated first by rebels, but outlived by its own money.